Welcome to the Deep Dive Book Club podcast. I'm Joel.
I'm Leo, and for anyone just tuning in, this podcast is centered on having long format discussions about books we have read or in the process of reading. We dive into both fiction and nonfiction books. The only thing better than reading a good book is having a great discussion about it.
I would love, Leo and I would both love, if you reached out to us to share any of your thoughts and opinions. You can find us at Patreon/Deep Dive Book Club, X at Deep Dive BC, Instagram, Deep Dive Book Club, YouTube at Deep Dive Book Pod, or you can just send us a good old-fashioned email at deepdivebookclub@gmail.com.
You could try messenger pigeon, but I don't know if we'll get it. So, today, Joel, we are continuing our conversation on The Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt. We have had a lot of good conversations about this so far, and let's just keep it going with Chapter 5. We're going to start with a quote by Epictetus. Quote, "Do not seek to have events happen as you want them, but instead want them to happen as they do happen, and your life will go well." End quote. Joe, what do you think about that quote?
I love that quote, and I've come across this quote in different words by different people, and I have come to the same conclusion in my own life, that you end up being happier if you accept the situation for what it is instead of fantasizing about what you want the situation to be.
Do not seek to have events happen as you want them to, but instead want them to happen as they do happen. There is definitely something to that. It's something that, I have to think about quite a bit. And it rings very true because it is so easy, just, thinking here, my own experience, it's so easy to slip into fantasizing like, oh, what if I won $1 million? What if this? What if that? And then you're just dominated by the what if, and you don't pay attention to what is. And that it's a very attractive illusion that to me just leads to emptiness.
It does lead to emptiness. You end up living in a fantasy world that doesn't allow for you to really enjoy what is in front of you. One of my favorite ways that this has been put is by our grandfather, who grew up on a farm in South Carolina, and he had mentioned he came to the conclusion, you look at a three-legged dog, and that three-legged dog never gives you the inclination that he is lamenting his life or that he wishes he had his fourth leg again. He just goes about his life and is as happy as can be. And that stuck with him when he had his three-legged dog on the farm.
That's a pretty good image. I mean, that's true. You see a dog like that, a disabled animal, that they're just as happy as they can be. That's very true.
Almost like a zenful being in the moment and just appreciating what it is that you do have.
In this line of thinking, and why Jonathan Haidt puts it in here, is because of his argument that he's building towards of having a strong internal source for happiness balanced with external. And this is one of those pieces of advice that I think kind of sits in the medium of both of those. It's from the inside out, looking at the world around you and how things affect you, and being more conscious about how those things affect you and your narration of them, your interpretation of them.
Now, we're talking about this in a nice philosophical way, but if we were to pull this into a utilitarian viewpoint, Leo, how do you think we could achieve this outlook, or how possible even is it to have this outlook?
Being realistic, I think that for some people, this is going to just naturally by default be easier, and for other people, it's going to be much more difficult. Someone who is naturally a little bit more neurotic is going to have a much harder time with this, and someone who is naturally a little bit more conscientious is going to have an easier time of this, just very broadly speaking. So with that caveat in mind, there's always room within what the hands you're dealt. There's always room for your own willpower and free will and moving things in specific directions of your own intention. So how to achieve this viewpoint? For me, the way this manifests for me is catching myself whenever I find myself entering into unproductive fantasy land of the what ifs that are unproductive. Again, like, what if I won $1 million? Well, what if I want? That's an easy problem, so I don't need to think about it. So I'm wasting precious brain power and daydreaming time on this rather than something more productive of how am I going to look at the next book we're reading? How am I going to focus on the next philosophical, mining opportunity? That's one way for me that I work on that.
I agree with you that the individual does have a certain extent that they can do or not do this and make it a truly internally driven effort, because some people can naturally be just more optimistic and some people will naturally have a more difficult time having that optimistic viewpoint. But like you're saying, one of the real life examples I have is fantasizing about the free time I have in the morning, because sometimes my free time in the morning gets stolen away because I have other obligations, and then reminding myself that I get to do these things because I'm alive, rather than I'm upset because I've lost that morning time that I'm used to doing more self-gratification or things that make me happy in the morning. It's too easy for me to start getting grumpy or upset about the loss of that time rather than just accepting what that day is going to be.
That's a very good example, and I find myself doing the exact same thing. If plans don't go the way I thought they were going to go, sometimes I'm fantastic at it. All right, whatever. This is where we're going now. This is what we're doing now. And other times it is something that I trip over. It's like, no, I had planned this out. Like I'm usually someone who knows what every general part of the day is going to be, and I'm usually stressing out about, okay, how do I cram this in? How do I cram this in? How do I do this? And so it's easy for me to trip over that particular obstacle it's really just an illusion. Okay, you made a plan, you did what you could, and, life had another thing in mind for you that day or that 15 minutes, or, hey, here's a traffic jam, or here's a quick trip to the emergency room you weren't planning. It just happens, and it's usually already difficult enough without adding on you grumping about or worrying about it. And so, yeah, I trip over that all the time, and it's just one of those things where I have to put that part of myself in the backseat. Hang on.
Maybe one of the ways that we can look at tailoring our lives to this is catching ourselves when we trip over that. And I really like, right, we get to do this, even if we're obligated to do the thing. The fact that I have a person I love to take to the emergency room is in itself a gift.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for that mental tool. When it arrived for me, it was impactful in my life, and the timing of it was really nice because it was the last major, not speech, but kind of talk that the CEO was giving for the company I was working for at the time that I was able to be a part of, because in a matter of weeks after seeing that idea presented to me, tragedy struck, and I had to immediately leave that job to go take over a family business that really needed, some saving at the time, just because of some personal tragedies that happened. And that was a very hard time, and that constantly played in my mind. You don't have to do X, Y, and Z. You get to do X, Y, and Z. And that completely rewired my outlook on things when I was able to successfully apply that mental tool. So that is another way of applying a very similar way of thinking.
Nice. Now, with life, what would life be without having goals? Leo, do you want to bring us into goal-related pleasures?
Absolutely. I would love to do that. So research shows there's two types of goal-related pleasure. The pleasure you get as you make progress toward a goal, and the type of pleasure you get when you have achieved something you want. The pleasure gained along the way seems to be the more satisfying and reliable of the two. Quote, pleasure comes more from making progress toward goals than from achieving them. Shakespeare captured it perfectly. Things won are done. Joy's soul lies in the doing. End quote. So we quoted Haidt while he was quoting Shakespeare. Quote within a quote. But that's a perfect way of summing up the two different types of pleasure you get from that. And if you think about it from a practical standpoint, you do get most of the pleasure of a goal from the pursuit of it rather than the achieving of it. The running a race, we've given this example before, just from our own experience to help understand this, is getting ready, doing the training, doing all the prep work, seeing the progress, and then working towards running the race is much more cumulative joy and pleasure than the actual crossing the finish line, which is fantastic. It's fantastic crossing the finish line. That's a great feeling. especially if it's a very hard race or a very, a personal record of some kind. Fantastic. But it's the working towards it that ultimately provides more meaning and joy.
I've felt that sensation in terms of the progress or journey being the slow drip joy rather than the crossing the finish line, which is like the flush of joy. But definitely in a utilitarian standpoint, I get more joy over time if you were to say, take the integral of or the area under the curve. That has a larger area value than just the single spike at the end. Plus, I love those types of projects that almost don't have an end, that they are almost a perpetual event, and you can continue to derive joy out of that. The easiest one that stands in front of me is martial arts. Earning that belt is not as good as every day or every session working towards training your body.
A question I have about this is, while we can sit here and talk about how much we enjoy the cumulative effects of work making progress towards a goal, do you find yourself sometimes getting sucked into the trap of overvaluing the finite finish line joy versus the pursuit?
It's really easy to find ways to do that for longer term goals, in my opinion. As an easy example, getting a college degree or getting some type of educational degree, you're looking at 4 years, or with master's degrees, 2 years, PhDs, 5 years. In those super long goal-oriented things, sometimes I think in the trenches of those activities, it's easy to start overvaluing that end goal.
Which brings me to the follow-up thought to that, which is, okay, it's easy for us. My theory is that we do have a bit of a dysfunction in our society that points us in that direction. And I think the example you gave is a pretty good one, where the education system is focused towards results and finite results when it's the pursuit of the knowledge that is doing most of the work for actually educating someone.
I would agree with you. In our post-consumerism culture, we are focused on goals and goal orientations. And as we talked about with Burnout Society, sometimes the could do something becomes should do something. And why aren't you producing more? Why aren't you producing social media content on top of writing a book, on top of owning your own business, on top of all these things that become almost like this expectation that we have rather than enjoying the process or journey of?
That's one frustration I remember having in college. Was I would get so into a particular research paper and working, and I would get frustrated with the fact that the deadline was coming up, not because I lamented my ability to meet the deadline, but because I didn't want to stop researching and digging into and creating the work and pursuing the knowledge, and balancing that across a full class load. It was just, I just remember feeling constantly frustrated. It's like I'm running through all of these subjects, and I'm running through all of these big varieties of pools of knowledge that I only get to sip out of rather than take a deep dive in. As you can tell from the name of our podcast, that I really enjoy deep diving into stuff and really digging in, especially into literature and books. But that was a constant frustration I had in college. I want to keep, research. I remember one was researching how solar works and the power grid and how the power grid needs to change to meet the way solar works, particularly in a way that can actually be useful in the future. And that was a fascinating subject for me. And I wanted to just keep digging into it. And I had to move on, had to turn in the paper and move on.
To play devil's advocate here, for society pushing these kind of short, shallow dives and then a continuation, we do have a limited amount of time. No matter how you want to slice it, no matter how you want to say you should slow down and enjoy life, at some level, we have a finite amount of life, and the amount of human hours towards achieving something is a very real resource to be balanced.
And along that same line of thought, limitation is in its way a really good ingredient for creating great pieces of art, great pieces of technology. The advancements that are made in pretty much any field, usually a deadline or some kind of urgency just magically helps that. Because if you say, hey, you have 100 years to come up with the A-bomb, might not even happen. But if you say, hey, we have to win this global existential crisis, okay, you have a Manhattan Project. There is some urgency here. It's almost like magic. The deadline has an extreme influence on that human creativity, that human will to create and get something done. So there is something very powerful about limitations and boundaries. That's true.
I absolutely agree. And I saw this a lot in the research field. Because you have these limitations, or you have a certain amount of funding until a certain date, you have to produce results. Although that can produce some negative results, we're never going to get away from that finite resource mentality, because that's just the world we live in. So yes, I think our society does encourage some of the goal orientation or the post-goal pleasures we get. And although we can back up and remind ourselves to enjoy the journey on the individual level, I still do see the value of having goal-oriented pleasures, or in the utilitarian sense, deadlines that limit us.
Which, brings me to a little bit of a tangent here. Maybe not a tangent, but with this line of thinking, this reminds me of a nice heuristic question that I like to ask sometimes that you don't like hearing is this a bug or feature of our society? Is the timeline and the overvaluing the finite pleasure, is that bug or feature? And it sounds like from the thoughts we're tossing back and forth that it's a little bit of both, that it could be a little dysfunctional. Maybe in some contexts we overvalue finite goal pleasure. In other areas we could be a little bit more mature as a society to value the pursuit of and see more flourishing in certain parts of society. But at the same time, we achieve certain things just because we're valuing the short term, the finite, the limited, the bounded progress.
Plenty of feature-related effects because of that.
But also bugs and dysfunctions. Okay, that is all the thoughts I had for the 2 types of goal pleasure. It's a perfect subsection in the Pursuit of Happiness chapter. Are you ready to move on to the next topic we've got to cover here? Again, I love all these topics. So, based on the presented research, Haidt states that it is possible that, quote, in the long run, it doesn't much matter what happens to you. Good fortune or bad, you will always return to your happiness set point, your brain's default level of happiness, which was determined largely by your genes, end quote. Joel, how do you feel about this adaptation principle, this almost genetic thermostat we have?
With the current research that I've been exposed to, I have to agree with him. We look at people that have amputations or extreme changes in their body and capabilities, such as handicaps, or we have
extreme life events like winning the lotto.
Lottery winners. And we often see both of those people eventually return to the same baseline happiness. So right now the research points to this is exactly correct.
Thinking about this adaptation principle and experiencing it, I know it's correct. I want to know how you feel about it. How does that... It's almost like a genetic determinism.
Thinking about how we can affect the way we think about things and how we can improve our happiness if that is a particular goal. Because it reminds us that even after you achieve X goal, whether that's money, career, anything, ultimately you'll return to the same level of happiness. So in that point, you should just try to be happy right now. One thing I've seen for my colleagues is after they finish school and they go and get that big job, they end up getting a lot of money. But I've noticed even after they have lifestyle inflation or an increase in the spending because they have an increase in their income, they don't seem any happier. They don't seem any more joyful or overall just satisfied with life. They seem to be the same. Although sometimes, though, if they were in a difficult position, they do seem more relaxed or more comfortable because they have less of a resource insecurity.
I've seen the same thing where as long as resource insecurity or financial stability is achieved, that people are pretty much the same after that point. And that's, that goes back to it's now kind of dated by, I think, more than a decade, but there's a certain level of income past which it would not increase happiness. And that's true. Once you have a certain level of financial stability, at least in my experience, people I've worked with, that they don't get happier for every additional dollar they make. I think for me, what stands out about this adaptation principle is it is surprising and something that bears consciously think about often, that our brain is always wanting to revert to a default happiness level, which for some people that's great, but for a lot of people that's not good. There's a level of neuroticism and baseline, not depression, but baseline negative affect that they get pulled to, that they have to constantly tug against, that's more difficult for them than for other people. And another aspect I like thinking about this in is, okay, if this is a thing, can we expend a constant amount of energy in an intelligent way to kind of lean away from it in ways that we want to avoid? So for example, getting a new car, that first day you get the new car, you feel great, unless you have buyer's remorse, which I usually do for large purchases. But otherwise, you feel great. That first week, fantastic. Next week, great. 3 months down the line, you might still be feeling pretty good about it. A year later, it's just your car. For most people, now that's just your car. That's just what you drive. Knowing that that's almost always going to happen, that's my question that I ask myself. Okay, is there a way to lean away from this pull? If this is a gravity, can I at least lean in the opposite direction? Can I maintain a glide longer away from this being pulled back to default, or being pulled to becoming desensitized to something that I find temporary joy or happiness out of? Well, something I think about.
In a utilitarian, what to walk away with as a usable tool, I like that a lot, to try to maintain that happiness, joy that you get from something, or even as a warding of, well, do I need to spend this money to buy that new car, or will I end up in the same happiness level 2 years down the line? And so that's something I can see as a tool.
You're talking about going the opposite way. If I'm going to desensitize this eventually, why expend resources unnecessarily? Yep.
Yeah. Just as a tool or question for you to ask yourself when you're looking at getting a certain item or thing.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Although I have asked that question before, and the answer is actually no. In 2 years, this will still have increased my happiness.
Okay, let's take a quick break, play some interlude music, and then we will jump right back in, and we're going to visit Epictetus and Buddha again. So, in discussing pursuing happiness, we're going to take another little visit to Epictetus and Buddha as well. And Haidt's going to give us a little overview of historically how philosophers and spiritual thinkers have looked at happiness and the different forms that have been advocated. And this is building towards his ultimate happiness hypothesis. So this is an early version of it. So here we go. Ancient sages like Epictetus and Buddha advocate for forms of non-attachment, which is meaning achieve peace by letting go of things outside your control, including attachments to relationships. Conversely, Western thinkers often advocate for a kind of inverted philosophy in relation to the non-attachment one that goes something like, through passionate attachment to people, goals, and pleasure, life must be lived to the fullest. Rings very Western to my ears. So Haidt's early version of the happiness hypothesis that he presents at this point in the book, in light of these two approaches to happiness from a philosophical standpoint, is something like, quote, happiness comes from within and happiness comes from without, end quote. So let's look at both of these a little bit. Joel, how do you feel about the pursuit of, if not happiness, peace through non-attachment?
Thinking about the story of Siddhartha and looking at the suffering as a tenet of life is quite an interesting way to view the world. And in my history of religions class, learning about the spread of Buddhism at the time and how there was a lot of pushback in Taoist cultures because they didn't see the suffering as a tenet of life. They couldn't connect to that because in their world, their worldview had more of a, well, life is happy because you have these interconnected relationships, usually through family and community. And I still think there's all of these people are trying to achieve the same goal and approaching it towards different ways. And each one has its own merits. Looking at having peace in your life as a way of detaching from things outside of your control, that is certainly a avenue. I can definitely see the benefit of it. And in many ways, that coupled with some Western philosophy of Stoicism seems to get towards having an individual trying to maintain their own internal homeostasis in a mostly positive manner.
One of the ways that I like to think about it that occurs to me, as I'm sitting here, racking my brain about this and I'm getting ready for this podcast, is the idea of grip, like physical grip, gripping something. That's kind of the way our brains work, is through story and narrative and embodied action. And the word non-attachment, the idea of non-attachment, one of the ways of thinking about it brings to mind physically attaching to something. We do that through our grip, our hands. And for me, what seems to maybe bring me some peace or resonate with me is how hard am I gripping something? If I fully let go of the object I'm gripping, well, that's not tenable, at least, for me, philosophically, that just doesn't seem tenable to fully let go, to sever that connection. On the other hand, if I grip something so hard that I'm hurting myself and the object I'm holding on to, the object of my attachment, then that's just causing pain and suffering, usually to multiple parties. So for me, there's a balance of how hard you grip something, how loosely you grip something, how close you hold something, and how distant you let that attachment be from your central worries or your central, concerns. And that helps me. Like, what's the appropriate distance? What's the appropriate grip for the thing that is concerning me, or the thing I'm worried about, whether that be a relationship or a pursuit or the future or, news or anything, that helps me. Like, do I have the right grip here? Do I have the right emotional and philosophical distance here?
I think that's a great tool, especially with the news or other things you have no control over. If you overgrip it, you end up hurting yourself.
Yeah. For me, that's a embodied metaphor that helps me think about that. Now, on the other end of non-attachment, how do you feel about the idea of, quote, living life to the fullest?
Or as other people say, YOLO, gotta live it to the fullest because you only have a limited amount of life whatsoever.
We could take a whole tangent on how philosophically interrelated. We could make a Venn diagram. Okay, where does YOLO fit, and where does living life to the fullest fit, and what's the overlap there? That sounds like a fun, silly project to do at some point. But how do you feel about that idea, living life to the fullest? Between the two, which resonates with you more? For me, just on paper, I see attractions from both.
It's very hard to pick only one, especially because each one has its own pull and has its own benefits. I think it's tough to really line that up together because on the one hand, I agree with the Eastern philosophies of letting everything go, everything that's going to happen happens, and you end up having almost like a null anxietus or a no worries mentality about things because you have such little control. On the other hand, though, the idea of having influence and control and working towards living life to the fullest and achieving as much as you can, being a noble pursuit, also has its merits. Not to say that there's anything wrong with living a simple farmer's life in the mountains in Himalaya. Living a simple farmer life in the Himalayan mountains, there's nothing wrong with that, and it can be a beautiful life. But on the other hand, things are typically achieved through having goals and goal-oriented pursuits.
So maybe a sidebar, maybe a tangent, maybe the next step in this conversation, but you're using the word achieve, and that makes me think of Byung-Chul Han and his Achievement Society idea. where happiness becomes conflated with achievement and living life to the fullest. I think the question that presents itself to us right now is, does living life to the fullest, does that simplified, summed up philosophy necessarily have to have achievement as a component of it? Is living life to the fullest also intertwined with the pursuit, achievement, acquisition? What do you think? I don't know. My inclination to say no, it doesn't necessarily have to have achievement tied into it, but I need to reason through that and think it out a little bit more.
Very tough question, and I think it harkens directly to this question of kind of the happiness from within, happiness from without, living life to the fullest. All of these, in my opinion, kind of pull apart from each other.
You see what I'm saying, though? It's I don't know that you're falling into any particular trap, but you're using the word and idea of achievement, which I think is a valid avenue through which to pursue, quote, living life to the fullest. But is it necessary?
I could sit on the fence here and say both either way, but instead I'll just lean towards the utilitarian idea of, yes, part of living life to the fullest is achieving something. Now, does that achievement have to agree with, say, the hero system that society has laid out for you? No, not necessarily. But you nonetheless achieve something if you end up being goal-oriented towards acquiring happiness. Now, that achievement might just be your goal was to get super fit or be able to run a marathon or have a family or any of these things. You end up achieving something in your own mind.
Right, but that's achievement, and I'm still not convinced that achievement and living life to the fullest are one and the same.
Could you live life to the fullest without having any achievement?
That's what I'm asking.
I think you then enter the Eastern philosophy idea of just living, just being in a mindful, meditative state at all times.
I think part of what we're bumping into here is between the two, non-attachment is a lot more definable, ironically, than the little bit more sentimentality laden idea of, quote, living life to the fullest.
Yeah, non-attachment can be achieved relatively, not easily as in low effort, but easily in terms of a philosophical endeavor, because a farmer living with his family is living life to the fullest in the extent of Eastern philosophy lenses of having no attachment.
A farmer living with his family is living life to the fullest because of non-attachment? What? I did not follow that.
Sure. So, peace and happiness through non-attachment, so an Eastern philosophical lens, provides an avenue for people to be happy regardless of their station in life. So, anywhere from the emperor all the way down to the farmer could achieve non-attachment and thereby happiness from the lens of Eastern philosophy.
Okay, I can follow that. I can kind of see where you're going with that. Yeah, I don't know. That might be a really good one for us to pursue. That might be a good episode in and of itself, of looking at that idea of living life to the fullest, the history of that idea, where it comes from. Hey, maybe we can find a good book on that idea. But I think that's a good one for us to put a pin in for now, because that is I see the rabbit trails going in many directions here. And I think, as we go through these chapters and we pursue the line of thought here that Jonathan Haidt laid out in front of us, the question that comes up for me is, okay, is combining these two a good recipe for happiness? And if so, at what ratios? How much can we combine, non-attachment and peace from within with peace from external sources and, pursuit of living life to the fullest? Is there a way intelligently to combine these two? And if so, what's the mixture? Is it necessarily 50-50? Is there a 60-40? Is there a 70-30 that makes sense? And then, is it different per each person? Is it different for different stages in life? These are the questions that present themselves to me. Any more thoughts here for you, Joel, on these two sides of the coin of pursuing happiness or peace?
No, in my chair, I don't see a good conclusion to this because it's such a big and wonderful question.
The best kind of questions. Okay, now let's talk about love. So I want to read a little bit of a longer quote here that Haidt brings up when he's talking about different types of love and the myth of true love. Are you ready? Quote, "As I see it, the modern myth of true love involves these beliefs. True love is passionate love that never fades. If you are in true love, you should marry that person. If love ends, you should leave that person because it was not true love. And if you can find the right person, you will have true love forever." A little bit later on, he says, "Many young people in Western nations are raised on this myth, and it acts as an ideal that they unconsciously carry with them even if they scoff at it." End quote. You know, this book was written about 20 years ago, right? And I'd say this is still a myth that is still alive and well in our society and our culture. Joel, what do you think keeps reinforcing this myth in our culture? I have some ideas. Would you like me to tell you mine, or you want to tell me yours first?
The myth of true love. I would like you to tell me your ideas.
So the first thing that comes to mind here is movies. Movies and TV shows. I think those are probably the biggest propagators that come to mind as kind of a knee-jerk reaction to this question of constantly pushing the true love angle. And one thing that made me think of this is just the other day we were having a discussion with someone and we were talking about the surprising changes in depictions of a character in a fictional setting over the past 100 years. We won't spoil it now because that's probably a great future topic for us. But what was surprising was a character who started out in short stories and books, and in the 90s and 2000s had movies featuring this character, that initially there was no love interest, and in the movies there is now this seemingly unnecessary love interest because the character was so interesting to begin with. And you know, I was scratching my head, and our friend was saying that, well, that's just what the writers come up with in movies. Like, well, okay, who's the love interest? There's got to be some sort of love interest, some romance. That's what sells, and it seems to be an artifact of movies and shows, and it's still very much alive and well. You could see it changing. You could see many more types of movies are popular, but if you think about it, there was a whole spree for 30, 40 years there in the late 1900s where romantic comedies were all the rage. And then even beyond the romantic comedy side, there was love interest in most films. So that's what I think propagates this myth of true love. And then we kind of reinforce it in our popular consumerist culture.
In alignment with your thought, when I was listening to a podcast about prenuptial agreements from a lawyer standpoint, they also brought in a really good research article and someone else that was talking about our all or nothing concept of marriage and love now. They were focused more on the idea of marriage in the podcast, but it's still the same process where nowadays, and with the development of modern pop culture, we have the consideration of a all-in-one marriage. The person that you're married to should be your love interest, your romantic partner, your best friend. They should complete you and give you spiritual satisfaction, all of these things. And we kind of put that emphasis on this idea of true love, which is a modern and novel concept because for the majority of history, and different time periods differ wildly, especially geographically, but marriage was not a all-in-one love mentality. It was very frequently a political or social bridge, but that person didn't need to be in love with you. That person didn't even need to be your lover. That person also didn't have to complete you on a spiritual level. And in many ways, that was almost like a business agreement.
That's a very good point, and we probably unknowingly listened to the same podcast interview with that very well-spoken lawyer who talks about the practicality of prenuptials and how it's not unromantic to have well-thought-out prenuptial agreements. And in fact, the statistics he was talking about was that couples who take the time to create good prenuptial agreements actually have a higher success rate in having a long-term relationship.
Yeah.
Which is surprising at the surface level, but when you actually think about it, it makes more sense. And again, not to sidebar too much, but that's one of those things. Okay, which direction does the correlation go? Is it people that are more likely to do a well thought out prenuptial agreement are more likely to have a successful long-term relationship, or is a good prenuptial agreement an ingredient to a successful long-term relationship? So anyways, that's a digression. That's a sidebar. And you bringing that part of it up makes me think another potential answer to this question, and tell me if you disagree here, could be specifically with our culture, and along with that, combine that with the over-consumerist bent of our society. Those two combined, I think, lead us towards overemphasis in pop culture and marketing and consumerism for youthfulness, a bias towards youthfulness, and undervaluing of older age groups. And so the milestones and activities of the younger parts of life, finding a mate, falling in love, that first initial stage of relationships, the puppy dog love phase, as it's called sometimes, gets overvalued and overemphasized in pop culture and popular media. And doing that leads to an outsized idea that, oh, this part of the relationship should last forever. If the lovey-dovey, head over heels initial stage of a relationship fades, then it follows a lot like what Haidt was talking here. The popular unspoken belief is that, oh, that's not true love. That's not a good relationship. The relationship's fading. You need to go find someone where you can maintain that initial stage of the relationship your whole life.
And what a myth that can be, but we've put such an emphasis on that. But I agree with you. We definitely have a hyper-individualistic society, and that ends up having its own consequences. This easily, I think, being connected to one of them.
And just for a counterbalance to that, we can think about cultures who have arranged marriages, where someone who's maybe sitting very ensconced in the American viewpoint could be aghast at that idea. What do you mean arranged marriage? What do you mean my parents pick out who my spouse is going to be? But there's the rates of happiness and successful relationships are equivalent, if not better, to Western relationships.
Are arguably, right? Only because those countries that I have in mind that do that, it's significantly harder socially to have divorce.
But even Americans who come from that culture say the same thing, especially in the Indian Americans I know who have, if they have not had arranged marriages themselves, have family who have done it and parents who have done it, and say that they're perfectly happy, and it's an equally plausible avenue for happiness and long-term well-being.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with you there. I've been over to India, to Indian weddings. Chapter 7, The Uses of Adversity, we encounter the research findings that when someone overcomes obstacles, hardships, and stress, they often grow and become more resilient afterwards. The extreme version being post-traumatic growth. The question then presents itself, is adversity necessary for growth and development? And are the highest levels of growth and development only available to those who have faced and overcome great adversity? Haidt often very carefully leans towards yes for both of these questions. And we can see plenty of examples in life where this person or war hero or someone that had a great thing taken from them overcomes that adversity and becomes even greater for having accomplished that. But is it true? What do you think?
I tend to agree with that you need to go through something difficult. You need to go through something hard to grow, to develop. And you won't know your limitations. You won't know where your limits are if you don't find them, if you don't push them. And that's almost always well outside your comfort zone. Your level of discomfort, whether it's working out in the gym, whether it's pursuing a career, whether it's pursuing a degree, you need some sort of adversity to help you find the contours of not only who you are, but who you could be. And I don't know, I lean towards yes on both of them, where adversity might be a necessary ingredient for growth and development. And the second question here, are the highest levels of growth and development only available to those who have faced and overcome great diversity? And a lot of times you see this with historical figures. They've overcome some of the most extreme adversities, and they come out the other side, the shining historical figures that they end up being in our history books because of partially, I think, because of the extreme adversity they've gone through. Do you tend to agree with that? Do you see some other possible angles of looking at that?
It would be hard to argue against adversity developing growth, or the traumatic events happening for someone, typically creating them to be a stronger person. Although that's not necessarily true. Plenty of times, traumatic events just make someone worse, and that's never going to change. But the hardening of an individual through very tough events is something I think each of us can see either in our life or in people around us.
And, the next question that kind of presents itself in the direction this conversation is going, what I was trying to get at before you interrupted me with your dropping stuff all over the place, was the next question that naturally seems to present itself based on what we're talking about here is, okay, if adversity is a necessary ingredient for growth and development, and, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger is actually true, then that leads to a very hard, decision framework for parents and teachers and older siblings. How do you navigate this? Because as a parent, for example, you want to protect your kid from suffering and too much adversity, and you want them to have a happy life, but it paradoxically seems that adversity is a necessary ingredient for happiness and overall life satisfaction, because that allows them to properly grow and develop and find their limitations.
People that grew up in affluent families, and that child, when they become an adult, really fail and lack the tools and skills to grow and develop because they didn't have adversity. They weren't faced with, so to speak, traumatic events where they were able to harden and steel themselves against such things, and they trip over small things that they should have gotten over to begin with.
And you kind of see that historically from at least in American history, where immigrants who flee a harder situation to try to make it in America achieve great things, and partially because they came from something much more difficult, a very adverse situation that allowed them to flourish here in America. And you get exactly what you were talking about. That comes along with trauma that propagates itself through generations, but you also get that spark, that motivation, that extra kind of gas in the tank that allows immigrants to achieve so much.
Absolutely. I think I forget all the statistics, so I won't quote any numbers here. But when I was looking at immigration here in America and going through the research for that, it's like the vast majority of technology innovations and starting new businesses, it's an extreme amount of them are all from immigrants, especially compared to that percentage of the population.
Right.
I think part of it is that ability to say, well, I went through harder things, or I had these traumatic events, I can work through this now.
And kind of, again, the direction this is going leads to another question I have is being a, quote, overprotective parent or overprotective guardian, is that a form of I don't know, harm, handicapping a child's development, their potential?
I would say so.
Yeah.
It's almost a coddling or over-loving where you are injuring the person even though you're doing it through love.
Right. And I think there's probably a lot that Haidt has to say about this, specifically because he wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind that was published after The Happiness Hypothesis, that I would love to go through. And if the listeners are interested, that could be on our list of books to go through, because this is a fascinating topic for me.
Yeah, that'd be a great one. With that, maybe we should even make that another episode into it of itself, because this is such a good question.
Right. Okay, so any other thoughts here on the role of adversity, the uses of adversity?
I have a lot of thoughts, but before we go too deep into that rabbit hole, I'm okay moving on.
Okay, let's move on. The next thing I wanted to talk about was something that Haidt brings up, that this is the first time I've seen this particular model of personality, and this comes from the psychologist Dan McAdams, who proposed a 3-tiered model of personality. The first level is basic traits. The second is characteristic adaptations, and that would be things such as values and life stage concerns. And the third part of the 3-tiered personality is our life story, what Dan McAdams calls our life story. Our life story is basically the story in our heads about our interpretation of our past, present, and future. The kinds of stories we tell ourselves seem to determine how we respond to adversity, growth, or defeat, which is a very good point, because you see sometimes in tough situations or ongoing tough times where the same two people can be under the same adversity, and one seems to flourish and the other seems to kind of wilt, where it feels like a defeat. Now the person it is catalyzing them to higher levels of growth and development, and it allows them to shine. You see this in history with military leaders, where having a tough time, having a harder situation allows them to really come into their own, and others you see crumble under the pressure of the adversity over time.
It reminds me of a particular event that I had with one of our mutual friends who was a combat medic in the military, and him and I ran a obstacle race together. It was a little bit different than an obstacle. It was like a scavenger challenge difficult race that had a whole bunch of other stuff in between, like moving a whole bunch of heavy equipment, rock climbing, a vast thing. It was a pretty tough race, but very fun. And him and I did it, and we were getting to the end, and we'd like finished, and there were prizes for where you won. I think we won second place, which was super awesome for us. And we were talking about it. He's like, Joel, just something I saw in you that I saw in some of the people during my time serving is having heart. And he's like, I don't, you can just tell who does and who doesn't have heart. And I saw people that pulled through injuries that had heart, and I saw other people with lesser injuries not make it just because they didn't have that. So he was saying heart, but he was meaning a deeper characteristic of a person. And I think part of that here, if I were to like have an interpretation here, is personality model that we're applying from Dan McAdams. And there is something almost intangible here I think we could really dive into, and what does that mean for people that crumble or can grow and achieve.
It is very interesting to see different people in different situations, and who flourishes and who, despite all the promises that they like, how promising they are. I've run into this in various teams where it's so interesting. Someone who seems like they have a lot of potential and a lot of like the sky's the limit for them crumbles, or the adversity really defeats them or puts them in a dark place. And on the other end, like you see some people who just in general are maybe a little duller personality wise. I don't mean intellectually, just they're in a situation or in a team, they're just coming off a little bit more dull, not intellectually, but then hardship starts taking place, adversity starts taking place, and then you see it's like a polish. They start shining more brilliant. You see a brilliance come out that was only possible because of the hard situation. And it's a fascinating phenomena to watch. And I'm very glad that it's pointed out in this way, because I really like this way of looking at personality, because this is an important component that I have not seen explicitly pointed out before, that makes up who someone is as a person. And for me, the way I like to think about it is the narrator in my head. Okay, what is the narrator in my head saying about the situation we're in? Because there is the situation such as it is, and there's also my interpretation of it. And it's that interpretation that I'm interested in, what influence that person's having. And we can go back to what we were talking about earlier about like if your plans get changed, is that upsetting or is that catalyzing? Is that something you could just shrug off and move on, or is it something you stumble over? And the decision there is a lot to do with how your inner narrator is talking about that situation. How is your inner narrator interpreting it and telling you. You know, he's like a guy sitting behind you saying, okay, that's fine. We can keep on going. Our plans changed, whatever. Let's go do this. Or, you know, maybe your internal narrator didn't have his coffee that day and he's like, well, this is unacceptable. You can't have this. And he's almost like your coach pointing you in one way or the other of how to interpret the same event. It's the same on paper. It's the same exact event. It's your interpretation, your narration that changes.
I consider this, maybe you can disagree with me, that this is very closely related, almost the same as the idea of locus of control, where the control lies. Because I do see some people with that narrator's viewpoint say, well, I failed, or this event didn't work because of insert external factor, or because of internal factor, and I'm going to fix this internal factor.
Yeah, I think it is closely related to that. I think there's a lot of overlap. I think maybe where it diverges from the overview we've seen here, how it's laid out in this book, is some of the stuff we're talking about is a lot of in the present. How are we interpreting a thing in the present or in the very recent past? That thing that just happened, how am I interpreting that? How am I narrating how it goes? And to the things that distinguish this model from at least the overview we're seeing in the book is it's also your whole life story. You know, where are you going in the future, your further past, your childhood past, like all of it. How is a whole life story manifesting at the personality level? And I think that's where it diverges. And this is, again, you know, this is another topic where we could just keep going on. And this is another one where, dear listener, we would love to hear your feedback. Hey, do you want us to find other books on this topic and dig further? I mean, for me, this is a fascinating topic, and your feedback will help us determine which books are on our shelf to read next.
I'd love that. Great. Do you have any other opinions on this? I really enjoyed McAdams' 3-tiered model. I think it's great. And like you said, I could talk for the next 30 minutes about just this one topic.
No, I think that is a good stopping point for that particular topic. There's, you know, many more that I want to cover. Do you want to take a quick break and then we can jump into topics covered in Chapter 8, The Felicity of Virtue?
All right, let's take a break. Okay, and with that, coming back from our break, we have had a wonderful time looking at our recording. We're already over the time. And yet again, although we tried to finish this all in one, it looks like this will be another 3-parter. But I don't lament that, and I would be remiss not to remind myself and the listeners just how wonderful of a book this is, how impactful it is, and Haidt is in a really good position here of writing about deep, impactful questions that society has now. And he's in a structure of doing research to approach these questions. And so I'm glad we're taking our time to deep dive into all of these wonderful topics he has given us.
Yeah, and we are kind of doing exactly what he proposes in the beginning of the book, is taking just a handful of great ideas and delving deeply into them. That's what he does in the book itself, and we are emulating that same action as we're exploring the topics in the book. And that's kind of what we do. Instead of, you know, breezily covering a book or a work in an episode or 30 minutes or so, you know, very, very few times do we ever get a work done in a single episode. It's almost always a multi-part conversation, just because of we chew on it quite a while when there's a lot we talk about. So I think, like you said, that's a great spot for us to pause our conversation for now on this good book. And I thank all the listeners for listening. This, of course, has been the Deep Dive Book Club podcast. And please send us your thoughts, your questions. Joel, where can they reach us?
Good old email at deepdivebookclub@gmail.com, Patreon /deepdivebookclub, X at deepdivebc, Instagram /deepdivebookclub, YouTube at deepdivebookpod. Or at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, leave us a note and we will deep dive down to it.
Just as soon as we build a sub. All right. Talk to you guys next week.
All right. Everyone have a great week.